Okay, last thing I want to go over with you before you get ready for the AP exam is type 1 and type 2 errors. These are errors made not necessarily by you, but by weird things that happen in the data. And we'll talk about those. So if you pull out page 132 of your packet, and it says type 1 and type 2 errors, I need you to take some notes on some things that I'm going to be going over in this video. So the first thing I want you to be aware of is what a type 1 and a type 2 error is. Type 1 error is when you reject the null. The data says you're supposed to reject the null, but it turns out later on you find out the null is true. So your data lied to you. So the error is coming from the data. It's not anything that you've done. It's what the data is telling you. Your data is saying, oh, we're supposed to reject the null, and it turns out, we find out later on, that was not true. We should have... The null turns out to be true. A type 2 error is where we fail to reject the null, which remember is a fancy way of saying the null is probably true. And it turns out then that the null is probably not true, which means the alternative is true. Okay, so these are the two types of errors. I'll write this down in your notes. Type 1 error, reject the null when the null is true. And type 2 error, fail to reject the null when the alternative is true. The easiest way to keep track of this is to make this table here. It kind of help keep things straight. Okay, so if I reject the null, which means the null is probably not true, then that means the alternative is true. So that's a correct decision. So I'm going to drag this up here and put correct decision here. And so if I reject the null and the null turns out to be true, that's what we call a type. Whoops, not that one. Type 1 error. And if I fail to reject the null, and the null turns out to be true. If I fail to reject the null means the null is probably true, and it turns out the null is true, HO is true, then that's a correct decision. However, if I fail to reject the null and it turns out the alternative is true, then this is a type 2 error. So we copy this table down just as you see it, and your note on the notes there, it helps you kind of keep track of this, and whenever questions come up about type 1 and type 2 errors, you can have this table in your mind or in your notes, okay? So let's take a look at some examples. Okay, so a person goes to the doctor, and they're either sick or not with the flu. But they test them for the virus. The test either comes back positive or negative. There are 4 things that could possibly happen. 1, person has the flu, and the test comes back positive, saying he does have the flu. That's a correct decision. Person does not have the flu, but the test still comes back positive. That's a type 2 error. Sorry. The person has the flu, and the test comes back negative. That's a type 1 error. It means they made a mistake. The last option that happened, the person does not have the flu, and the test comes back negative, which is what should happen. That's a correct decision. See, there are 4 different things that can happen whenever you're doing any kind of testing. Okay, and this kind of puts the frame of type 1 and type 2 errors in the frame of a context in which you can understand. So we're going to look at some examples to try to figure out what these are. So here's a problem. Parent believes your child has strep throat. Child does have strep, but the test doctor comes back negative. So there's a mistake made here. So this is definitely an error. So it's not no error. So the null hypothesis is the child has strep throat. The alternative hypothesis is the child does not have strep throat. But the child does have strep, but the test at the doctor's comes back negative. This is a type 1 error. The null, we reject the null, even though it turns out the null is true. He does have strep. And if you had done this in class, you would have been able to check your answer and see that our answer is correct. Okay? All right, so here's another situation. The coach believes that athletes on the team are doing drugs. An athlete who has never used drugs still comes back with tests positive for doing drug use. So in this situation, our null is the athlete does use drugs. That's what the coach believes. The athlete does not. The alternative hypothesis it does not use. So this is a type 2 error because now the alternative hypothesis we were supposed to reject, and it turned out the alternative hypothesis was correct. It never used drugs. So this is a type 2 error. Next one. A can of cola measures a mean weight of 12 ounces. A sample of 100 cans has a mean weight of 12.5 ounces, so obviously bigger. This is outside the confidence interval. So assuming it's a 95% confidence interval, means it's outside of that. In fact, it's on the higher end. So that means if you think about a bell curve, 95%, there's 5% on the two tails. means that it's in the 2.5%. On the high end side, that's half of 5%, so 2.5%. So the p-value has to be 2.5% or lower. Well, under normal conditions, we would reject the null in that situation. Okay? However, it's found out the true rate is actually within the interval. So that means that our data said, oh no, he's outside of the interval. Well, the p-value is very low, but it turns out that was acceptable, should have been in there. So this is a type 1 error. Anytime your null hypothesis gets rejected, but it should not have been rejected. The alternative hypothesis is when the alternative hypothesis should have been rejected, but it wasn't. Which we say when we reject the alternative hypothesis, that means we failed to reject the null hypothesis. Failed to reject means the same thing as accept. We just never use those words. Okay? So in this case, a teacher gives a test to 5 sections of statistics. So it makes the hypothesis that all calc classes will have the same mean. Upon analysis, he finds that all the means fall within a 95% confidence interval of the population. So our null hypothesis is all classes have the same mean, all classes have different means. Well, she finds out that all the means are within a 95% confidence interval. None of them have a low p-value, means that all the classes have the same mean, which means that there is no error. This is a correct decision. Don't check the answer. Yes. Okay. So again, this will give you a hint. Whenever you see an error made where the null should have been rejected and it wasn't, or the null should have been accepted and it wasn't, you know it's got to be a type 1 or type 2 error. Okay, so use these as notes to help you when you get to the AP exam. More than likely, there won't be a lot of questions on type 1, 2 error, but just in case, you now have a rough understanding what this means.